to be key issues. I see we're being recorded, that's fine.
Sorry, that was my fault, Sheena. Sorry for interrupting. Yeah, someone's just messaged me. Yes, they will be recorded, and I'm now recording. Thank you very much. Back to you, Sheena.
So I'll start off by outlining the BAWE corpus and the genre families, because this is where most of our research has been done. And then I'll look at the link between social purpose and argumentation, which I think is quite interesting and worth thinking about. And then I'll talk a little bit more about essays, because that's where argumentation is most central. And finally, a little bit about registers of argumentation and different types of essays that we've identified in the BAWE corpus, in registers of the BAWE corpus. So first of all, the BAWE corpus and genre families. I'm sorry if this is repeating for some of you, but it might be new for others. This was part of a project that we did. That's the research team there, Hilary and Paul, I'm sure many of you know, and many of the others. We collected assignments at 4 different universities, the ones at the bottom, and it was a funded project aiming to investigate genres of assessed writing in higher education. And we had EAP in mind. We wanted genres that were going to cross disciplines so that it could be useful for teaching English for general academic purposes across disciplines when we did it. The project aimed to develop the corpus, and the corpus is readily available. I'll tell you about that in a minute. To characterize genres across disciplines and years of study, and you'll see our corpus design. And we decided to focus on proficient student writing assessed in the disciplines. So we took papers that were graded A's or first class, or however they were graded, from the disciplines, so from chemistry and sociology and so on, had been graded as such in the disciplines. So when we collected them, we didn't collect them on the basis that they were well written. We collected them on the basis that they had been given a high mark in the discipline. And so we inferred. So there are mistakes in the corpus, as I'm sure any of you will know who've looked at it. So I say we collected the assignments. It sounds simple, but as all EAP teachers know, it's never that simple. And we had lots of different strategies for doing that. Researchers can access the corpus from the Oxford Text Archive. Just have to say that you're wanting to do research on it, and it's free. And students, teachers, and learners can access it through the Sketch Engine interface. Is probably the easiest way, and that's the link. And again, it's free, so you can search for words and collocations and sketch differences and things. So we wanted to make the corpus readily available. This is what's in the corpus. It's about 6.5 million words collected from about 1,000 different modules, 300 different degree courses. We didn't limit it to first language speakers of English. We took all proficient writing. And at the bottom right, you can see how we sort of organized the corpus. So 4 years of study. So that's first year, second year, third year undergraduate. And then year 4 is basically taught masters. So we were looking at assignments more than dissertations and projects. And then 4 disciplinary groups, and that's the number of assignments for each. So for arts and humanities, first year, we had collected 255 assignments. So the 4 disciplinary groups, for each disciplinary group, we selected about 6 disciplines. So it's not all the disciplines in the university, so apologies if the one that you're working on is not there. But we just wanted to focus a little bit more so that we had a critical mass. So for most assignments, we would have 5 or 6 instances so that you could see patterns of writing emerging. Those are the disciplines, and those are the disciplinary groups. The disciplinary groups were chosen to match the base corpus, which looked at spoken English, so that comparisons could be done between written and spoken English. And then Hilary and I read all the texts, and we grouped them into 13 genre families. So some of these genre families were quite easy to identify. So methodology recount, which is basically lab reports, they were quite easy because they all had the same structure, they all had the same purpose, and they all seemed to be doing much the same sort of thing. Others were a lot harder and took us a bit longer, and we had to go back and we interviewed students, we interviewed lecturers as part of the understanding what was going on in the texts. But we came up with 13 genre families, and each assignment text is allocated to one of the genre families. We call them genre families because in each genre family there will be half a dozen different genres. So these are not genres, these are groups of genres with the same sort of purpose and the same sort of unfolding of the text, the same structure, using an SFL type definition of genre. So, and then when we came to write the book in 2012, we wanted, 13 chapters was too many and made it sort of unmanageable. We wanted to make it more manageable. So we started thinking about sort of graduate attributes or writing purposes, or, you know, what is it that makes university writing specific? And this is when we came up with these 5 writing purposes. Now remember, these work for the corpus that was collected at the beginning of this century. So they won't work for all cultures and they won't work for all times. And maybe it's time we should be revising them, but some of them I think will stand the test of time. So the first one, demonstrating knowledge and understanding. People go to university expecting to learn the latest knowledge in their subject. And explanations are really good genres for assessing that. So when someone does an explanation, how does the eye work? How does a wheel work? How does bread rise? You know, that everybody in the class is expected to basically give the same explanation of how things work. So this is sort of factual understanding of the latest whatever. A second reason for going to university, a second graduate attribute, and a more traditional one, perhaps, is building research skills. So the idea that people might progress from an undergraduate degree, from a master's degree, onto a PhD or into a company to do research. And the assignment genres that seem to develop those skills most are the literature survey, the methodology recount, which is sort of lab reports, and the research report. So we grouped those 3 under building research skills. And again, the expectation is that university graduates, particularly in some disciplines more than others perhaps, should be able to go on and do independent research. The third expectation of university graduates, and these are the people who are often hired by the civil service and so on, is that university graduates should be able to develop an independent argument. They should be able to look at evidence, to assess it, and put forward a theory about why it's the case or how things are working. So developing powers of independent reasoning. So the essays and critiques, where essays, I'll talk about a bit more. Critiques are basically where you evaluate something. So book review, film review, product evaluation. So here, unlike the explanation, you would expect everybody to come up with, or it's possible for everybody to come up with different theories, different theses about different independent reasoning. But what they have to show is how their argument is based on evidence at the university level. The fourth one was very popular at the time that we collected data. It is still popular, I think, but this is the one that perhaps might change. I mean, now we might have something more global on it, I'm not sure, or digital or whatever. So we've called it writing for oneself and others. And here we've got empathy writing and narrative recount. And this is sort of where people would do reflective writing. PRPs, professional, portfolios were very popular at the time. So there was a lot of emphasis on getting students to do something and then to reflect on it. So that's where we put empathy writing and narrative recount. And then the last one, preparing for professional practice. So we see this in medicine, we see it in engineering, we see it in teaching. And the assignments that seem to be particularly looking forward to professional practice were case studies, which you get in business and in health, design specifications, typical in computer science, problem questions in accounting and law, and proposals, which you get throughout all the disciplines. So that's how we came up with the 5 writing purposes and the 13 genre families. So when we look at these and we think about integrity, argumentation, ownership and social purpose, we can sort of realize that there's different things going on. So when you do a lab report, it's important that you report accurately. You're sort of dealing with facts and observations. So integrity is probably key there. When you're writing an essay, it's independent reasoning. You're wanting to look at, how students are able to develop an argument. With personal writing, I've put ownership. Catherine Eccleston has a lovely paper where she says, well, it doesn't really matter if the reflection is true or not. how are we going to assess that? What is it? What is reflection all about? If they say they liked it, or they say they didn't like it, if they say they would do it this way, if they say they would do it that way, do we believe them? Does it matter? So the whole question of ownership comes up there, and how you assess it, but it's a very different type of writing. And then I've added authenticity, which isn't in the title of today's event, but I think perhaps it could be, because when we look at professional purposes, we're looking at, how authentic is it? Is this what you would have to do if you're an engineer working for a company, or if you're a teacher teaching in a classroom? How much does it address the personal, professional purposes? So we can see that argumentation really comes into its own in independent reasoning, but there's a lot of other writing that students do where integrity, ownership, authenticity might be more relevant. It's quite interesting if you look at the literature. I did a paper on however, which is open access. You can find it in JEEP if you're interested. And so we looked at what people said about however, and who uses it and how they use it and so on. And we've got two big applied linguists, Doug Biber and Ken Hyland, with Doug Biber saying, oh, however is really used a lot in scientific writing for comparing facts. And there's an example from the BAWE corpus. Because the flow has been tripped to turbulent in the turbulent flow, blah, blah, blah. However, this is not the case. So that's where he says it's used a lot. Whereas with Ken Hyland, he says, oh, no. However is used a lot in the soft disciplines for discursive writing, for building arguments. And here's an example from a law essay. The case of Harold Shipman illustrates the possibility of individuals seeking to, and their potential to do so would be fostered by a regime. You can see all this sort of the modality that comes through in the discursive writing. So we're not really dealing with facts. We're dealing with ideas. This may even prove to be the system. So possibilities and sort of exploring ideas rather than facts. So two very different types of argumentation. And I'm going to focus more on the second one, on the discursive. But it's important to remember how many of our students go on and do the first type. And in pre-sessional courses, you can find out what your students have to do. I'm sure you do that. So I'll look a little bit more about essays. I want to say three things about essays, and then I'll go on to look at register. Look at some examples of essays. What do I mean by an essay? Sometimes an essay just means a piece of student writing, and that's not what I mean. I'll look at individualizing arguments, what strategies students can use to make the argument their own, and how claims are made in essays. So first of all, here are some examples of essay questions from the BAWE corpus, from lots of different disciplines. And you can see what they have in common. Did Neolithic people really hate fish? Grazing, good or bad? What factors caused a gladiator to be viewed? Can the economic history of Britain be described as an industrial revolution? Do male and female poets use the dramatic monologue? Does functionalism and feminism? So basically what's happening in an essay is that you have two participants, I would say, two concepts, two substantive entities, if you like. And the students are asked to discuss the relationship between them. So it's not like a book review, it's not evaluate a book, it's not one entity, it's two entities. So that obviously gives them scope for developing an independent thesis, as they're expected to do in essays. And of course, what they have to do is they have to know the discipline, so it has to be from the disciplinary perspective, and they have to know sort of the theories that have been talked about in the lectures so that they know what's in and what's out, and they can sort of build that into, and they have to use evidence. But basically, it's how are we going to relate these two things, and what answer am I going to give to these questions? They're generally questions. So that's what I mean by essay. And you'll have exposition essays and discussion essays and so on, so challenge essays. And there are lots of, I think we had a half dozen different types of essays in our corpus. So one of the strategies that students use, and this is worth teaching, is to narrow the scope of the question. So if you were to look on search engine for focus, then you would find lots of examples of strategies of students narrowing the focus of the topic. So the second one, in particular, I would like to focus on Britain. So that's for an economics paper. Perfectly legitimate thing to do, and you can see how it makes that paper about Britain. Someone else might have said, in particular, I would like to focus on Hong Kong. So there's no right answer, but narrowing the focus just makes it more manageable and makes it more individual. Sometimes they say things like this one: this debate is too large to be explored in this essay. I kind of don't like that very much, but it happens. It's not uncommon. And an agent-centered theory of justice will be assumed to be valid. So again, it's narrowing the focus on mainly on these areas. So sometimes the focus is perfectly understandable. Sometimes it's a bit iffy. Sometimes it really has to be justified. But it is a good strategy for essays, and it's a way of, if you have to do what you say you're going to do, don't you? So if it's a way of making sure that you can answer the question in ways that will be individual to you and that will be less likely to be questioned. The third thing to say about essays is that making claims in essays really differs across the disciplines. So if you're teaching if-then constructions, I don't know, when I taught general English, there were 3 if constructions, I think, if one, if two, if three, something like that. So when you teach academic English, you have to teach it for your discipline. So if we think about, let's start at the bottom. If we think about philosophy, this is the kind of logical if-then. If Descartes' argument is guilty of circularity, then it can be entirely dismissed because being self-contained, it's impossible to prove one way or the other. So there's a sort of logic there, logical possibilities. And that's rather different in the others. If we look at archaeology, if this was why they were hunting them, then you would expect to see occupation during the summer and autumn. So here, the if-then is based on evidence of what's here. What can you infer about the past based on the archaeological evidence? It's a very different type of claim being made. I love these English ones. If Mrs. Alving represents modernism, then Pastor Manders is the voice of Victorian values. No logic there at all. I really struggled with English literature as a student, and I think if I'd done the analysis I've done since of how people write in English literature, you're sort of asking the reader to entertain your ideas. So it's not based on any logic. It's not based on argumentation in the sense of logic or in the sense of past evidence from the past to the future. It's based on an interpretation of the text. And in law, therefore, the courts have made the presumption that if agreements are made in a social domestic context, then there will be no intention, and the reverse will be true in commercial contexts. So again, we're not looking at facts. We're not looking at evidence on the ground. We're not asking the reader to just think of this, but we're looking at the case law. So the basis of evidence of making claims in law essays is case law. So the case says this, therefore that's what we do. Doesn't matter if it's true or false, that's what we do. So when you look at argumentation, authenticity, integrity, it's very different across disciplines, I would suggest. So finally, I want to look at evidence of different types of essays from register analysis. Some of you I know all about multidimensional analysis, probably more than I do, and some of you may not. So bear with me while I try and explain what it involves. Basically, so this is from a paper that we did with Biber, and what happens is that all the features in the corpus are tagged as nouns or verbs or conjunctions or whatever. And then the computer program looks at where features cluster. So at the top of dimension 1, we've got pre-modifying nouns, common nouns, passives, action verbs, concrete nouns, and quantity nouns. So lots of nouns and passives, concrete nouns, quantity nouns. So this is, you could sort of guess that this is sort of scientific writing. Very different from at the top of dimension 2, where we've got mental verbs, think, feel, stance verbs, that deletion, communication verbs, first person pronoun, I and we, and past tense verbs. So there's clusters of these features, and those, as we'll see, sort of cluster in reflective writing. And in the third one, we've got a lot of present tense verbs, modal verbs, and subordinating conjunctions. And we'll see where those cluster. And then this fourth one, which is what some people think of as academic writing. We have long words, we have lots of nominalizations, we have abstract nouns, and we have attributed adjectives. And we'll see where those cluster. And then in dimension 1, so this is the sort of strongest dimension. These are the most frequent and strongest clusters. And where we have those features in the sort of scientific writing, we don't have the ones at the negative end. So the communication verbs, the stance adverbials, third person pronouns, and so on. So we have dimension 1 positive and negative, dimension 2 positive and negative, dimension 3, dimension 4. So this is what multidimensional analysis does. It shows you where these mostly grammatical features cluster. And then what we did was to try and match the clusters to the sorts of texts that occur in them. So not surprisingly, we found at the top of dimension 1, we had a lot of text from physical and life sciences, and we had a lot of methodology recounts and design specifications. Top of dimension 2, we had a lot of reflective writing. Top of dimension 3, we had a lot of texts from philosophy and from maths. And top of dimension 4, we had a lot of sort of political science and social science more generally, but mostly political science, a lot of essays, and a lot of level 4s, a lot of master's level work. And so those essays were quite different from the essays at the negative end of dimension 1, where we had a lot of arts and humanities essays, levels 1 and 2. At the bottom of level 2 of dimension 2, we had biology explanations. At the bottom of dimension 3, we had history, classics, and comparative American studies essays. And at the bottom of dimension 4, we had basically non-academic writing, which occurs in empathy writing and in other genres. So if we carry that forward, I'm going to look at examples of the essays. So we've got arts and humanities essays, we've got history and classics essays, we've got political science essays. So at the negative end of dimension 1, we've got these first and second year humanities essays. This is an example. So talking about proper names, using third person pronouns, very much sort of telling what happens in history or in literature or so on. So you can see some of that's an example of a humanities essay from first or second year. Then at the top of dimension 3, this is from a philosophy essay. So you can see first person, you can see the modality, you can see the if then. So a very different type of argumentative writing. In this essay, I will briefly outline, well, that happens in lots of different disciplines. That's not particularly relevant to maths and philosophy. But the next bit, I will then suggest that if we accept one or more of these views, we are not consequently tied to certain answer to the question of whether morality should be private. So you can see the if-thens and the sort of logic coming through it. If we reject objective moral truths, we may still be reluctant to adopt, blah, blah, blah. So lots of modality, present tenses and first person. This uses I and we, but we is not uncommon there. And then the fourth one, so this is the postgraduate writing this is dimension 3. So this is the opposite end. This is the history, classics, and American studies. So here we see a lot of past tenses, but that's basically because of the evidence. The British became, the Dutch entered, they caused, the fleet returned, the British roundly defeated, they gained. So a lot of saying what happened, and this is factual to some extent, but we will, and this is where the evaluation has to be much more subtle. So you can see, for instance, on the last line, the intervention of the French fleet came at a crucial time. So this is where you sort of say what happened, but sort of put in your argument in a more sort of subtle way. It's a very different type of language that's used when you've got history and classics, so, because you report the facts, but then you also build an argument through words like crucial. And then the final one is the social studies, and this is where it's more abstract, a lot of nominalization, a lot of theorizing, really, longer words. And this is about the EU. In the context of the EU, the prevailing interpretations are rational choice, institutionalism. So these long nominal groups with long words, all of which need to be unpacked and explained. Historical institutionalism, predetermined interests in overcoming transaction costs. And so it's really to point out that not all essays are like this, which is what some people think when they think of academic writing. So those are the 4 types of essays that sort of jumped out of our register analysis. 4 types of essays in terms of differences in register. The first or second year arts and humanities essays, essays in philosophy and mathematics, essays in talking about the past, history, classics, and comparative American studies, and then your social science essays. So obviously, if you're teaching pre-sessional for masters, it's going to be different from if you're teaching pre-sessional for undergraduate, and the disciplinary differences are key as well. So what I hope to have shown is that argumentation differs across genre families. It differs across disciplines, it differs across registers, and it differs across years of study. So anything we say about argumentation, integrity, and authorial voice and ownership and so on is going to have to be mitigated through these prisms. That you can't say one thing that would apply for all of them, I think. Key references. So there's the paper that we did with Biber, which is open access in applied linguistics, our book, and there's the BAWE, all the references will be on the BAWE website, and that's the Sketch Engine website, which is where, as I say, students and anybody can use it to find out about to find examples. Thank you.